Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network. Hi, this is Amit Doshi, and I wanted to thank each and every one of our listeners. It's been 2 years since I founded IVM, and it's been an amazing 2 years. We wanted to learn a little bit more about who is listening to our shows, and so we put together a short survey. The survey is anonymous, and we aren't going to be collecting any personal information. I would really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes out of your day and go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and fill it out. Thanks, and please keep listening.
Hello listeners, my name is Munaf Kapadia.
And I am Nabil Merchant. We are the co-hosts of the show My Neighbor Zuckerberg.
On this show, we invite ordinary people who have extraordinary stories to share.
Tales of creativity, persistence and struggle. We call them entrepreneurs.
Tune in every Monday to listen to their journeys. We are available on iTunes, Audio Boom and the IVM Podcast app.
You're listening to the OnCourse podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to the OnCourse podcast. OnCourse is a creative and alternate education company that aims to bridge the gap between formal classroom education and real-world skills. So we offer a wide range of programs from short skill-based courses to test prep to application assistance for those who are looking to study abroad. My name is Alisha Mashruwala and I'm the CEO and co-founder of OnCourse.
Hi guys, my name is Akhil Daswani. I'm the COO and co-founder of OnCourse. And just to let you know, our main focus of the conversation today was going to be on Canada and Singapore.
I think what we'll do is maybe start with focusing a little bit more on the undergraduate application space for these two specific countries. So Canada, we feel like has become a very upcoming sort of destination for kids who want to go for their undergraduate degree.
Yeah, I feel like obviously with the recent rhetoric coming out of the US from the president, and there's been a lot of shift already towards Canada, but that was in any case already moving towards the country. One of the big pulls that Canada has is its really friendly immigration policy, and which allows the government to sponsor a student or anyone entering the country for up to 3 years. Right, and what that allows you to do is work with any size of company without the company having to bear a cost to hire you as an international student. If you contrast that to anyone in the US, the company bears the cost, and which only means that bigger companies can hire you if they feel like you're worth the cost, which obviously means there's less jobs for internationals in the US versus Canada.
And in terms of Canada, I mean, how is the program structured? What do they look at?
Oh, the program's very similar to the US. So North America generally follows a similar system of education. It's a very flexible system of education. The similar liberal arts curriculum that exists in the US exists in Canada as well. There's a lot of flexibility within courses. The structure is it's similar, but there's a little bit more structure around a Canadian program. Whereas in the US, you're pretty much free to choose among sciences, social sciences. Here you got to make the distinction between the sciences and social sciences and humanities, and engineering and business a little earlier, right? But within each, you have so much flexibility to choose.
So I guess being a 4-year program, it still offers that a little bit of flexibility where you can actually explore in your first year or so before you kind of take a final decision on what you want to focus on and, major in. So, I mean, I guess in terms of the admissions criteria, that's an important question that most parents and kids will sort of start having as they come into grade 9 and grade 10 and grade 11. So the main thing that Canada actually looks at when they're looking at an undergraduate applicant from any other country is, of course, going to be the grades. So the grades form the crux of everything. And in this case as well, like the US, they look at your grades from 9th all the way to the 12th. So for anyone who's entering the 9th or in the 9th, they're already on your clock, of course. So from 9th to the 12th, they want to see that kind of upward sloping curve. They want to see that your predicted grades by the end of half of grade 12 is high enough, which kind of forms about 80% of the entire application.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, and that's primarily because they don't look at standardized testing. So there's no requirement for any SAT or ACT or any other standardized test. The only sort of formality that they consider is a TOEFL or IELTS as an English language test.
Can you just remind all our listeners what the TOEFL or IELTS is?
Sure. So the TOEFL, IELTS are basically tests of English as a foreign language. So it's just for universities to get an idea of whether you can speak, read, write, and kind of comprehend English clearly enough. And most Indians, especially those who studied in English schools all through their lives, typically don't have much of a problem with it. It becomes more of a formality for a lot of these countries. I think the other important thing that a lot of people miss out in this puzzle piece is sort of the extracurricular activity bit, which Canada does look at. They want to see a good amount of social service. They want to see a good amount of leadership. They want to see interest in pretty much the course that you're planning to apply for.
So in terms of extracurriculars, do you feel the extracurricular activities have to be more structured like the UK, where everything's connected to the course you're applying for? So if I'm applying for business, I do internships connected to business. So I do research papers connected to business. If I'm applying for bio, I'll do research in bio. Or is it more like the US, where irrespective of what you apply for, you still got to do your community service. You still need to do a lot of things outside of, your academic interest. Which way is it, closer to?
It's definitely closer to the US. So Canada does want to see that you're contributing to the society. They want to see different talents and skills that you might have, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's dance. They like to see a lot of, sort of interpersonal reaction and group work and community work, those sort of things as well. And most of that usually comes out through your essays, right? So all of this is kind of a way for you to showcase what all you've done. It's a little different from the US, where, you have the option to send links, you have the option to send, presentations, research papers. In Canada, everything that you do kind of is reflected through your writing in the essays as well. So that, I would say, forms a good 20% of the application. So everything that you've done in terms of your academic school life from 9th onwards, along with your extracurricular activities, a lot of leadership, a lot of group activities is sort of what Canada looks at.
That's great. Actually, that brings me to the next question that, which arises is, how does a student actually end up applying to Canada? What exactly is the process? What kind of formalities does he need to sort of work through?
That's, I would say, one of the downsides or the cons of the Canada process at the moment. There's no perfect structure that they follow. There's no standard form. There's no standard system that every college follows as well. So it does become logistically a little bit more complicated than applying to the UK or the US for that matter. But typically, Canada kind of clubs it based on which region you're applying to as well. So if you're applying to Ontario, which means colleges in Toronto, for example, they have a separate application portal that you apply through, and that's kind of your first step. Once you've done that, then every college you apply to on that application portal pretty much responds to you with their own internal portals through which you send the essays, through which you upload your transcripts, through which you send recommendation letters or anything else that they might require. Whereas for something like UBC, which is more on the Vancouver side, they have a completely separate application altogether. And McGill, which is one of the other big colleges, where Montreal has a completely separate application process altogether.
Wow.
So it does kind of get a little bit mixed up, and it can get a little bit daunting for someone who's, sort of sending out their applications, because they're constantly getting emails from a lot of the Canadian universities with next steps. The other aspect, and it's very important to remember, that depending on the course that you apply for, you have different essay requirements, you have different recommendation requirements, and you have different profile requirements as well. So if you're applying for business, for example, you may have a video interview. Or if you're applying for the humanities and social sciences, your essays may be a little bit more geared towards leadership, teamwork, community service. If you're applying for engineering, then you have a long list of sort of activities you do need to fill in based on what you've done engineering related. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's important to know that depending on the course, you might have a separate application process from someone else altogether.
Wow, so that sounds a little complex. So if I'm a grade 12 student and I'm preparing to sort of apply abroad to Canada, what's a good time to start?
Starting as early as probably October of grade 12 is the best option. So most applications open between September and October and go all the way until January. However, given that it is a complex process and you do want to know your requirements as early as possible, if you submit your first form that you're going to do for the Ontario colleges or for UBC or for McGill around October or November, then you typically will hear back from the colleges about 2 to 3 weeks later with your next steps. So that gives you enough buffer time to kind of complete all of the application aspects as well.
Wow. I think that obviously brings me to the next question is, and I think you already touched upon this, what are some of the really good universities in Canada that are, high achieving students should be striving for?
Definitely UBC, which is British Columbia. You have McGill in Montreal. There's University of Toronto, which has 3 campuses in the Toronto region. There's York, there's King's, there's Queen's. There's also McMaster, Waterloo. So you have a wide variety of colleges. But again, for example, some colleges are a little bit better for certain courses than others. But
yeah, like I heard Waterloo's like really strong in its sciences and engineering, right?
Absolutely. Waterloo has a great program which is called a co-op program as well for engineers, where, if you can kind of take one semester off to work and get like actual experience before, you get back to campus. So that kind of gives students real world exposure, plus also gives them a potential opportunity for a future job as well.
Awesome. And I think that brings me to the last Canada-related question that I have is, given that people are becoming more and more cost-sensitive, how does the cost of Canada compare to the other countries, and what are the scholarship possibilities?
So Canada costs less than the US. It's approximately 45,000 Canadian dollars a year, including your housing and tuition.
And the Canadian dollar now is down to 50, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of works out more reasonable than going to the US, for example. But again, this is 4 years that you're going to be studying for and applying for. In terms of scholarships, there are a couple of scholarships for international students that they do offer. One, which is a fairly popular one that UBC offers, which is called the ILOT scholarship, which is a leadership-based scholarship. For most of the scholarships, you typically have an earlier deadline and you have an essay as well. For some of the scholarships, your school teacher, school counselor needs to nominate you, and typically they have freedom to nominate only 1 or 2 students for that particular scholarship. So if you're a really good student and keen on going to Canada, looking at potentially getting a good scholarship from one of the top universities, it's important to talk to your school counselor and your teachers about that as well.
Awesome. And, if I'm a grade 12 student, say in the IB board or say in the HSC board or in the ISC board, what would be a really good score for me to achieve to get one of those really great universities you mentioned?
You want to have a predicted score of about a 38 in your IB is what I would say, at least as a minimum barrier. For the ISC and HSC, you want to have around a 90%. That's sort of what they look at.
In the board,
yeah, and also predicted scores of that. A lot of the Canadian universities may give you a conditional offer, but that conditional offer is not as strong or strict as the UK. They typically will give you a condition just to ensure that you're not slacking off after you've got into college.
So if I miss the condition by a few marks here and there, will they rescind my offer?
If you miss the condition, yes, but the condition is not going to be as strict. They're not going to say 38. They're probably going to give a more reasonable condition of a 34 or 35, just hoping that you, again, don't slack off after you got into college already.
This is a little different from the US, right, where it's unconditional.
Yeah, so the US is unconditional, but they do have the right to kind of rescind your offer if you drop drastically. They usually say that, but they don't particularly give you a number that you have to achieve or accomplish in your final exams. So it's kind of in between the US and UK, I would say, where the UK is very strict about the offer that they give you, and the US is a little bit more lenient. Canada falls somewhere in the middle there as well.
Awesome. Great. So I think that brings us to the next part of our show today, which is Singapore. Alicia, why don't you tell us why Singapore has again become such a popular destination, and what attracts some parents or students to Singapore as an undergraduate destination?
So I would say Singapore has a few of the top universities globally. So I think it becomes a draw for a lot of people who kind of want to achieve and accomplish some and kind of make it to one of those top universities. The other aspect is Singapore tends to be a little bit closer to India. So a lot of parents from that perspective will look at Singapore as a good option in terms of, distance and accessibility as well. Cost is pretty much similar to Canada. So it is, again, less than the US as well. So just kind of talking about Singapore, Akhil, what do you think are the pros of Singapore?
Oh, I think there's so many pros. I think you already mentioned a few of them. I think proximity is a big one. I think the second big one is the job market is it's a little bit more welcoming versus a lot of European countries or the US at this point. they did have a bond, which obviously now is under debate whether they still are going to be offering it to international students. But that bond basically, was a clear indicator that the government wanted international students to stay back and work over there.
So can you tell us a little bit about the bond?
So the bond it's a state-sponsored bond, which if you sign that bond with the Singapore government, they subsidized your education, which would typically normally have worked out to about 20 lakhs a year over a course of 4 years for most programs. They subsidize it down to about 8 to 10 lakhs, with the caveat that you need to stay back and work in the country for 3 years, which worked really well in the past. Of course, now the reason that it's under debate is because they don't have enough jobs to constantly keep doling out the bond. But if you still look at it, 20 lakhs a year, similar to Canada to some extent, Canada being a little bit more, still works out about 60% of what the US charges. So it's attractive on cost. It's got a decent job market. It's close, for parents. And I think that in general, if you look at the Asian markets, they tend to be very, very strong on the management and very, very strong on engineering. So anyone going into one of these two fields, we just have a very natural advantage in Asia.
And what about some of the cons?
Of course, I think the biggest con being if I want to study a humanity or a pure science, they don't offer as wide a variety. They're not as flexible. They follow the UK system of education, which means I can't keep changing my mind. I have to go in and stick with what I want to study. Of course, there's no real sense of cultural diversity. While in the US or Canada or even the UK for that matter, you may meet people from 50, 60 nationalities. In Singapore, you're more likely to meet people only from Asian nationalities and predominantly Singaporean or Chinese. Which is, that it tends to be a more competitive environment given their the cultural nuances of such people also. So it's a very different sort of experience. It's a more academic experience. You don't get the whole, campus vibe. And Singapore being a city at the end of it, you don't necessarily build that whole college spirit which you may build in some of the other colleges. And
I guess with Singapore, the other aspect and something to remember is that there are only a few really, really good universities, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So like if you think about it, if you ask me, the three best universities in Singapore are NTU, which is Nanyang Technological University, NUS, which is National University of Singapore, and SMU, which is Singapore Management University. If someone gets an admission into one of these three schools, it's absolutely worth considering one of these schools over some of the best schools even in the other countries, factoring in all the other things we spoke about. They tend to be stronger on management and engineering, right? So for those two areas, these three schools are amazing. Outside of these three schools, we see a huge drop-off in terms of quality of institutions, in terms of quality of faculty, and we always then start, debating whether it's really worth a person spending that kind of money to go abroad at all.
Right. And I think with Singapore, the other aspect to remember is, again, the admissions process is a little bit different from Canada, US, UK as well. So with Singapore, most of the times they will look at your 10th grade final results. So that could be an IGCSE result or your ICSE result or SSE result or whichever board you're actually studying in. And besides that, they are going to consider your predicted and final grades of your 12th. So that's a little different from what we've seen in the past because your 12th final grades is what really will determine whether you're into the college or not. Most colleges will give you an offer only after you get your 12th final results of your IB or ISC or HSC or A-levels, whichever board you're actually studying in.
So in terms of timeline, when does a student actually end up applying to Singapore?
So most applications do open as early as October and November of your grade 12, but their deadlines are much later than that. So the deadlines are typically around February and March. So by then, a lot of kids will have already heard back from Canada, universities in Canada, universities in the UK potentially, a couple in the US as well. So their deadlines become a lot later. Once they've applied to college, they will have to wait until their results come out before they actually get a response from any of the Singapore universities. And even then, I would say there's no sort of guarantee that, the course you applied for is sort of the course you're going to get into. So very often you put a first choice and a second choice as your major. And say if you applied for mechanical engineering and it was too competitive a pool, you may get into your second choice, which may have been chemical engineering, for example.
Very interesting. So given that there's such few universities in Singapore that are worth chasing, what do you think the prudent application approach is for such students who are targeting Singapore?
Very simple. Keep your grades as high as you can, because grades is literally the pretty much the be-all and end-all of the application. And even in terms of any additional activities, Singapore is big on sort of Olympiads, any sort of extracurriculars that you've done linked to your particular course, so research work. It could be debates and months depending on the course you're applying for. It could be quizzes. It could be something like an internship as well. So anything very specifically linked to the course or anything very academic on your application profile is kind of what attracts them.
But given obviously the risk of admission into just the top schools, it does make sense for such students to also keep their options open with other countries or even back home, right?
Absolutely. I think it's a must, just given that there are only 2 or 3 potential colleges you may apply to. And that being said, you are competing with some of the best in the world. You're competing with kids from Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, so all over different parts of Asia.
Let's not forget China.
And yes, of course, China. So I think that's what makes it really, really competitive for anyone who's applying to Singapore.
Awesome.
So I think that brings us to the end of our segment today. Thank you so much for listening in. If you guys have any more questions, you can write to us at info@oncourseglobal.com. You could also visit our website on www.oncourseglobal.com or visit us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter.
Hey man, just help me out, man. I need some podcasts, man. I haven't had a fix in a week. Just need some.
Don't you worry about it. I got podcast galore for you, man. Just go to ivmpodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thanks, man. I'm gonna check it out.